Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are excited that so many of you could join us tonight for On the New Rules of Attachment. I'm Pelesh Shalev, Public Events Specialist for the California Institute of Integral Studies, a nonprofit university in San Francisco. We may be joining from different places all over the world, and as a representative of CIIS, I want to begin by acknowledging our debt and gratitude to the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original peoples and continual caretakers of the San Francisco Peninsula. CIIS campus is located on the traditional unceded lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone, which they call Yalamu. In the Ramaytush Ohlone language, Yalamu identifies both the people and the territory. This acknowledgement is just a single, small step towards being in deeper connection and relationship with Indigenous tribes and organizations in our community, and does not begin to acknowledge all of the native lands, languages, and territories where you are right now, or where you live and work every day. I invite you to take a moment now to acknowledge the land where you reside and to commit to learn more about the Native communities near you and to support their work. If it feels right for you to share in the chat, please do. We always recommend native-land.ca as a starting resource. I want to go over a few general tips and troubleshooting items. We will have a Q&A after the conversation tonight. Please submit your questions at any time using our anonymous web form, which is linked in the event description below this video. We do have automatically generated captions for this event, which you can toggle off and on using the closed captioning button in YouTube. Chat will be enabled during this event, but please note that it is not being moderated, and our presenters cannot see the chat. Chat is not required to fully experience the event. If you choose to participate in chat, please be respectful and avoid language that could be offensive or insensitive to others. You can turn the chat off at any time, and we encourage you to do so if you find that it is negatively impacting your experience in any way. If you are having issues with your audio or video, we always suggest that you start by refreshing the page. And then, if you still have issues, we suggest that you adjust your video settings within YouTube. Now let me introduce our presenters, Kini, Chang, and Dr. Judy Ho, and we'll get right to the conversation. Kini Chang is the chair and core faculty at the California Institute of Integral Studies Counseling Psychology Program, Community Mental Health Concentration. At CIIS, she has the opportunity to build a culturally and racially inclusive community of students, faculty, and leadership that embodies diversity and equity. She has the privilege of teaching and consulting for a number of higher education institutions and has been invited to speak at conventions such as the American Psychological Association, Western Psychological Association, EMDR International Association, and more. She comes from a liberation and social justice lens when working with trauma associated with systemic oppression, social inequity, community violence, trauma-focused attachment, juvenile justice reformation, and traumatic grief and loss. Her role as an educator, activist, speaker, and healer are guiding principles in her work in the community. Dr. Judy Ho, PhD, ABPP, ABPDN, is a triple board certified and licensed clinical and forensic neuropsychologist, a tenured associate professor at Pepperdine University, and published author. She penned Stop Self-Sabotage and The New Rules of Attachment. Dr. Judy maintains a private practice in Manhattan Beach, California, where she specializes in comprehensive neuropsychological assessments and expert witness work. She regularly appears as an expert psychologist on television, podcasts, radio, and contributes to other media, including print and electronic periodicals. Dr. Judy Ho is an avid researcher and is a two-time recipient of the National Institute of Mental Health Services Research Award. She hosts an active research program to improve mental health care for high-need populations. She often speaks at national and local events, including research, clinical, and corporate conferences and workshops for organizations and schools. Now, let me turn it over to Kini Chang and Dr. Judy Ho.
Hi, Dr. Judy Ho. It's so good to have you with us. I wanted to start by just acknowledging that you bring so much. So I'm noticing that there's some feedback.
Yeah, I'm noticing an echo as well.
Just hold on one second and adjust that. Dr. Ho, is there an echo still right now? Or does it seem like it has gone away?
I think it went away.
Perfect.
All right. Hi, Dr. Kini.
We can
How are
actually get
you?
started. I'm well. I've been dying to ask a couple of questions. I've started reading this text and it's been so exciting. I feel like Stop Self-Sabotage and this book go so well together. And I'm sure that's sort of the way that you were thinking, maybe even a part 2 or an additional piece to what you've already started working on. And I think one of the first questions that comes to mind has to do with, pop psychology, all the stuff on Instagram, all the things that people are attempting to learn about when it comes to attachment. And I think there's this feeling of, well, what's accurate? What's actually supportive to me understanding my attachment? And what's just out there that may not be beneficial or supportive to me? So I'm really curious for you, like how do folks discern that?
Yeah, I think that what we find in pop psychology, in online articles, is a huge focus of attachment on romantic relationships, which, of course, is a huge and important impact of attachment bonds and attachment theory. But it's a limiting way to look at it as well, because attachment bonds affect not only your romantic relationships, they affect your friendships, they affect your collegial relationships, they affect your family relationships, both with your family of origin and with the new family that you adopt as you become older. It also affects how you go about your career, your drive, your motivation. It affects how you take care of yourself mentally and physically. And most of all, it affects the formation of your self concept.
Yeah, and talking about self-concept, can you say a little bit more about the formation of self-concept? Because I think there's kind of the previous school of thinking around attachment, and we used to be in like these 4 quadrants. And your book specifically is titled, the new way of thinking about this, right? And the approach to it. And I really wanted to get some sense from you about what are we talking about here? What is your book bringing to the surface for us that's maybe in addition to the 4 quadrants of attachment styles we're talking about and what's happening in this space?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think that a lot of times when we're thinking about attachment, we think about these categories. And obviously, categories are helpful, they're valid to some degree. And also, as human beings, we're drawn to categorize things. It's kind of an easy way for us to try to understand what's going on. So we don't want to completely discount that. That's obviously important. But at the same time, it can also be so limiting in terms of how we think about attachment, because most people are a combination of styles as opposed to just one category. In my research and in my clinical work with patients, it's actually more common for people to show different spectrums of different attachment styles as opposed to just being in one category. Sometimes people will show insecure attachment at work, but they'll show secure attachment in their friendships and their family relationships. Or somebody might have a disorganized attachment style with romantic relationships, and then at work, they might have an avoidant attachment style. So I see a lot of different combinations of different things. You could also be secure in a lot of domains of your life, but maybe in 1 or 2 domains, you have an insecure type. So that's one, I think, misunderstanding that people have about just these 4 attachment styles and how categorical one really should be. I also talk to people about this idea of insecure attachment, essentially showing yourself usually at the most inconvenient time. So if it's something that you're really used to doing, you feel really confident about, probably operating pretty securely in those moments, but it's when a situation is novel. It's when a situation is challenging. That's when some of the shadows of your insecure attachment style might come back and produce negative thoughts and feelings and actions that don't move you toward the different goals that you have in your life.
That's super helpful. I think like for folks tuning in, just it's really helping normalize that, because there's this feeling of like sometimes categorizing ourselves then can also end up stigmatizing or self-blaming or other ways that we feel like there's something wrong with us, but actually it's really normal to kind of even move between these areas and to have some space for that, right? I was thinking about how does somebody then navigate what you just talked about? Like, I feel really confident. I feel really good at work. And I feel like I have it figured out and I can show up. And then I feel like home life is a a mess, and it's not, right? Like, you're fine. And there's kind of these juxtapositions about these areas of our lives, and sometimes it can feel really difficult to navigate that. Like, what is your thought or advice about how do you move through that, and how do you navigate that?
Well, I think that there's also some messages out there that make it hard for people to feel like they can move through these patterns. So
Mhm.
I've seen a lot of literature essentially stating, well, this is how this attachment style shows up. So then it feels like it's stable, that it's permanent, and that you're just going to try to find some way to struggle through it if you have this attachment style. I think it also sends that
Mhm.
message too for people who are in relationship with you, as they're reading something, if they think that they've identified your attachment style, like, okay, this person is anxiously attached. It's like a label. And then they think that that's how you're always going to be
Mhm.
in the relationship. And here's the things that you have to sidestep,
Mm.
etc. And I'm not saying that those things aren't helpful. I do think that the articles are trying to be helpful. It's like, let's understand ourselves,
Yeah.
understand our partners, but I think that it does a disservice and that it kind of makes it seem like, well, this is a label that you apply to this person and they're going to be like this all the time. And
Mhm.
I believe, and I have seen attachment wounds be healed at all ages and stages of life. I've seen people deal
Mhm.
with traumas from childhood decades after the trauma happens into their 60s and 70s and be able to shift their attachment style even at that age. And so I think
Yeah.
that that's the way you move through it, is just to have hope that this is something that you can learn. You can learn to be securely attached. It's like a skill that you can adopt. So the first step, of
Yeah.
course, is self-awareness, but the second step is really understanding that there is a path forward, that this isn't just an attachment style that you're quote unquote stuck with if it's an insecure attachment style that's causing you pain, and that
Yeah.
just like everything else, you learn the coping strategies. Every once in a while, you might find yourself in a similarly challenging situation, but now you know the way forward. You've done it before. You can bring
Mhm.
yourself back to that point of secure attachment again.
Mhm. It really makes me think about the beauty of neuroplasticity,
Yeah.
right? And as someone who studies neurology and all of those other areas, that the neuroplasticity is happening literally until the moment we die. And so the possibility of being able to shift that with every synapse and every memory and every corrective emotional experience gives us the opportunity for moving towards secure attachment. I love that. I think that gives me hope when I think about my clients or people who struggle with that.
Yeah.
There's something you talk about around being fiercely independent. And this stood out to me because I think about fierce independence as potentially sometimes a trauma response or a protective response, or like a defended place that if I can't count on other people to take care of me, I have to make sure that I can do it for myself. And I'm going to do everything in my power to do that. And I think in our society, some of that is even, acknowledged, celebrated, even like, oh, you can do it all. That's amazing. But there's a cost to that. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about your thoughts about this.
Well, I think that the fiercely independent style is one of the styles that I think people almost want to emulate. It's almost like a very
Mhm.
ego-syntonic style because some of the outward behaviors are so admirable. Like, wow, this person gets so much done. They're so self-sufficient. They never burden anybody with their problems. They've always got it figured out. And we're talking about the quintessential traits of the avoidantly attached person. And like you said, it is a
Mm.
coping strategy. It's actually a way of escape, and when it's overused, obviously can create all kinds of things like loneliness and toxic workaholism, and also this huge need to keep going achievement to achievement to validate yourself. And that can lead
Mhm.
to an increased risk of burnout too, which then leads to increased risk of mental and physical symptoms. So I think that when we talk about this idea of the fiercely independent, how do we help that person be balanced? How do we help them be more interdependent so that we can
Mhm.
actually work together and have room and space for that connection, but also still retain the part of you that is ambitious, that is motivated, and does have independence, because there are these upsides too for each of the insecure attachment styles. It's just about this idea of leaning
Mhm.
too much into one specific coping strategy to the point where it's not really serving you anymore.
Right. Thank you so much for saying that, right? Because I think there is absolutely strengths in all of the areas. It's how do we be able to move through the nuances? And when I heard you share just this last bit around the fiercely independent, it made me think about that we don't actually have to deal with what's really going on inside and how that matches with the avoidant piece. Because if we're on the next project, we're really busy, we're taking care of things, then we never really slow down or pay attention and notice what's really happening. And sometimes that's really scary
Yeah.
when we have to look at ourselves in a real way. And the silence can feel really loud sometimes.
Yeah. And I think that it's true for both. Well, it's true for all of the insecure attachment styles, I think, especially. But I can also see that being true for the anxiously attached person who basically will sometimes do the most um, unpleasant things for the people that
Mhm.
are in their life just to avoid being alone. Like, I've known anxiously attached people who are my friends and my colleagues and my patients who say, well, I don't want to be alone for any long period of time because I don't want to know what my mind is going to say to me. And so then they
Mm.
completely just fill their social calendar to the brim. And even when they're exhausted, it's like, well, I better go out with this person because one, I want them to like me. And two, if I stay home all night, then that's going to be a huge problem because my mind might run away. And then I don't know what it's going to say about me or anything else that's going on in my life.
Mhm.
So they use other people as a crutch for their coping, whereas people who have avoidant attachment, they use their work or achievements or individual goals as their coping. And then for people who have disorganized attachment, it's really just this bouncing back and forth between feeling like they're in fight, flight, or freeze. There's a lot of emotional dysregulation that can happen with that type, and it just doesn't feel like anything is stable. And at the same time, it's
Mhm.
also how they cope because they've survived that before, and so they're almost looking in some ways, even if it's subconscious, for chaos so they can manage and they can say, oh
Mhm.
my gosh, my life is so crazy, because it's the narrative that they know and at least they've coped with it and they're still surviving. So then they kind of fall to the familiar.
Yeah, I feel like this pattern is so common, especially growing up there, being in dysfunctional relationships or family systems or traumatic relationships from the past, that there's this comfort in the dysfunction. And so when things are going well, it can feel like boring, or this piece around like peace and boredom and having difficulty discerning that. And so I wonder, tying this with self-sabotaging, I wanted to actually loop that piece. And I know that was your previous book, but it's so related, right? But I think about, when does the mechanism or the piece of self-sabotaging arise? And how do you see it kind of get interwoven in these different kinds of attachment styles?
Yeah, I think so much of it is about um, our negative self talk, our inherent self talk.
Mm-hmm.
Um, our self talk is a quintessential part of being a human. We all talk to
Mm-hmm.
ourselves. It's kind of what's led us to the
Yeah.
top of the food chain, but it also leads to
Yeah.
the most stressful situations and the most painful emotions. Because just with self
Mhm.
talk, you can take yourself back to a previous time in the past that was really painful, or you can fast forward to a future that is catastrophic, even if it's never going to happen. And so I think
Mhm.
self sabotage occurs mostly because of our thought patterns. If we have certain belief systems about how the world works, how people are likely to respond to us, our capabilities to cope during stress, it's going to lead to essentially self fulfilling prophecies through our feelings and our actions. And then those then feed back on your thought process. And then you're thinking, oh, okay, well, this pretty much just confirms what I already know about the world. And then our minds are very selective in
Mhm.
terms of how it takes an experience. And so it's going to remember these things that confirm these pre-existing ideas about you that are negative, rather than seeing the information that might be disproving it and then saying, oh, maybe that means I have to change my worldview. I have to change my self-talk. We're less likely to do that unless we really take our thoughts out of that autofocus and then really put it in manual for a while and learn a new strategy to have more balanced and more realistic thinking.
Yeah, it totally makes me think of confirmation bias,
Yeah.
right? Like, we can even find journal articles that might not even have the best data to confirm our belief about ourselves, because we hope that that will continue, even if it's not in our best interest sometimes.
Right.
And that it's super normal. Like, as human beings, we do that. I was thinking about just the way that maybe if there was like advice or thoughts about how to shift that, right? How to shift that pattern, or how to shift that way of being. Um, and of course, we think about therapy as one, but how else would you say are ways that folks could shift that pattern?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to shift thought patterns, and the ones that I find that are the most helpful fall into three categories. The first category is questioning your thoughts. So many
Mm-hmm.
times we just take a thought as true. And
Mm-hmm.
essentially, we just kind of run with it like, okay, I've thought it, so it's going to happen, or it's already happened, or it is happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
But thoughts are mental events. And I recently came
Mm-hmm.
across some really interesting research about how many thoughts we have in a day. So, obviously, this has been a question that's been asked so many times. And depending on the research methodology, there's people who say it's 5,000, there's people who say it's 60,000. I mean, it's pretty hard to measure. But more recently, researchers at Queen's University, Canada, found this other way to measure thoughts. They actually measure them in terms of the number of consecutive thoughts that we have about a specific topic or theme. They call these thought
Mm-hmm.
worms. So they could be like, it could be hundreds of them, but they're all about kind of the same idea. And apparently,
Mm-hmm.
the average person has 6,200 of these in a day.
Wow.
Yeah. So what are the chances? And remember, these are thought worms. So these are consecutive thoughts. So it could be
Yeah, they're like,
a thought worm could be 3 thoughts, but it could be like 100 thoughts. So we have
yeah,
6,200 of these thought worms. And then if you really kind of break that down, how likely is it that all 6,200 thought worms are important? Just can't be. I mean, there's
right,
no way. But
for
also,
sure.
how likely is it that these 6,200 thought worms are all true? Also unlikely. And then I think of another study that I read that was so fascinating, which is there was a study at Penn State University. They asked chronic worriers, so people who had a generalized anxiety diagnosis. They asked them
Yep.
write down your worries every single day for 10 days. All of the worries, just write them for 10 days. And then they made these poor chronic worriers review these lists of worries every single day for 30 days to ask them how many of these actually came true. And what was so crazy
Mm,
is 91.4% of them were false alarms completely. Like no version of
yeah.
it, not even a shade of it became true in that time. So this just tells us that we need to start to question our thoughts more, take an attitude of curiosity
Mm-hmm.
toward our thoughts. That's really my first tip is, modifying thoughts first by just acknowledging that a lot of them might not be true. So question their validity. And an easy,
Mm-hmm.
concrete way to do this is evidence for and evidence again. So Dr.
Yeah.
Kini, this one. It's like, for a lot of people, it's easy just to kind of like divide up a paper into two halves. At the top, write down the
Mm-hmm.
negative thought you're having. And then one side would be evidence for, one side would be evidence against, almost like if you're in a trial in a courtroom. And then
Yeah.
just challenge yourself to actually write down observations. These are things that people could actually also observe, not just more thoughts that you have, but like if somebody else was in the
Mm-hmm.
room, they could be like, okay, yeah, that's true or that's false. And essentially write down
Mm-hmm.
everything that supports the thought being true and everything that supports the thought being false. Most people will
Mm-hmm.
find that there's usually something in each column. It's never
Absolutely.
always
Yeah.
true or no exceptions, right? And then so from this point, from that type of work, you can then move into modifying thoughts, which is my second category of techniques. And modifying thoughts is not just about this toxic positivity either, which is like, I'm going to say
Mm.
an awesome affirmation, like everything's going to work out
Yeah.
perfectly. Like, okay, well, that's also not very likely to be true, but it's about
Yeah.
recognizing both sides. And so I like to use the yes, but formula. So, yes,
Mm-hmm.
fill in with something that is true about what's going on that does suck, that isn't great. And then, but fill in with something that's going better, something that's in progress, something where you're taking agency through the problem, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
yes, I didn't get that promotion this time, but I'm starting a certification class next month. And I think that's going to give me more
Mm-hmm.
opportunities, right? That's a way that
Mm-hmm.
you can modify your thoughts so they're a little bit more balanced and accurate and complete. And then the third category is really just de emphasizing the impact of negative thoughts. There's going to be some days where you're like,
Mm-hmm.
I've done all this stuff and the thought is still just with me. I just can't get rid of it. And it's affecting the way I feel and affecting how I act and how I work. So, labeling is a page out of acceptance and commitment therapy. Essentially, you're just going to add a phrase in front of that negative thought to lessen its impact and its hold on you. So maybe if your thought is, I'm never going to have a good relationship,
Mm-hmm.
adding the clause in front of it, I'm having the thought that I'm
Mm-hmm.
never going to have a good relationship. So now it's about the thought that you had. You are
Mm-hmm.
the one having the thought. You are not your thought too, right? It's not, you're not like identifying yourself with your thought, But secondly, it just creates that distance. Like I'm having the
Mhm.
thought that I'm not going to have a good relationship. Doesn't mean that that's like a prophecy, and it doesn't mean that it has to be true. There's a lot of different versions that you can do of this too, where you like write down the negative thought on a card and then put it in your pocket. And then like anytime you're tempted to think about the thoughts, like, oh, don't worry, it's already in my pocket. Like it's there. And I'm just
Mhm.
going to move about my day. Or sometimes I just have people write the thought on a piece of paper and then just kind of hold the piece of paper. And you can see that there's an actual physical distance created
Right.
in the sentence that you added, so that the scary thought is now farther away from you and that you're really seeing the whole thing in context. And so there's a lot of different ways to kind of play around with that.
And when you're talking about this, one of the themes that comes up for me is that really around externalizing what feels like what's internalized as your voice or your reality. And even though it's true for you, the thought doesn't have to guide or make decisions for you. And that putting space between it gives you perspective so that you can actually choose probably more wisely or what's best for you or what feels more grounded.
Yeah,
Because when,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. And it's and what you're talking about, I think, is related to the concept of cognitive flexibility, like just being
Mhm.
able to apply what's needed in the moment as opposed to being in a fixed mindset, feeling like you're
Mhm.
never going to find your way out of it. I think that a lot of
Mhm.
times we're often likely to get stuck in those kinds of ideas. And then it
Yeah.
does become a self-fulfilling prophecy. You do end up self-sabotaging because your feelings and your behaviors are going to try to stay consistent. It's that whole concept of
Mhm.
cognitive dissonance. Like our minds do
Mhm.
not like to be in dissonance. And so oddly,
Mhm.
to actually make it in consonance, sometimes it actually veers towards making something negative. But as long as they match up, it actually
Yeah.
calms your brain. It's like the weirdest thing that we do this to ourselves. But we also have to remember that it's kind of a survival strategy that works well, that gets turned on its head. Because when things are dissonant, it makes you feel like you're supposed to be on alert, like there's a fight or flight that gets ignited. And we're not really
Right.
supposed to be in fight or flight so much. It's really only supposed to be very periodic and brief. Unfortunately, with chronic
Mhm.
stress now, it's like all the time, right? And it's not good for us. And so
Yeah.
your mind is trying to find some way to like get back to a norm. It's trying to get back to a baseline so that you don't feel like you're constantly like running away from a bear when you're not. And so it's basically an evolutionary advantage that gets turned on its head and ends up not serving us, even though its design
Yeah.
was to help us.
Right. Right. And I think for folks to know and understand that that's also part of our reptilian brain. It's evolutionarily there. It doesn't necessarily serve us the way it once did. And being again with that, being able to put some distance between that.
Yeah.
Just because my brain's telling me something doesn't necessarily mean it's true, which is a weird concept, I think, for some folks, right? Where you're like, how can that not be true? I'm thinking it, I'm feeling it, I'm experiencing it. It must be true.
Right.
And maybe it's not,
Maybe it's
not all
not.
the
That's
time.
all we're asking you to do is like take an attitude of curiosity and just say, is it possible that it's not true? Is that a possibility? Like, let's just consider that possibility? Yeah, you're
Right.
just trying to
Yeah.
use your critical thinking on your own thinking instead of
Yeah.
just taking everything as truth, right? I mean, think about how you are in life. Like, probably everybody here who's tuning in is a critical thinker. That's why you're interested in this discussion. That's why you're part of this process in
Mhm.
this community. So if you would question that in your real life, why wouldn't you question it in your own mind? It's kind of interesting how we just like take everything as is. But meanwhile, every time we read a news piece, we're like, are you sure? Like, you want to open that news piece? You want to do like some doom scrolling or like just go 5 articles into it and be like, is this actually true? How come we're not doing that with our own thoughts, right? We should at least ask the question.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'm sure maybe hopefully from this conversation, some folks will begin to be able to do that for
Yeah.
themselves. I was thinking a little bit more about codependency actually, and just around how codependency shows up. And there's this idea that's come up around like codependency, meaning both parties are dependent on each other. And I just think that's a little bit of a false, not totally correct term, that I think the word codependency can be confusing. And so I'm curious for just to kind of hear your perspective about like, well, what is codependency? And are there certain attachment types insecure attachment types that have a tendency more so than the other to fall into this role?
Yeah, people who are anxiously attached tend to be more codependent. And it's because a lot of their self worth and their self esteem is derived from making other people happy. Because as a result of
Mm,
making other people happy, they themselves then feel validated and supported. And it's one of the ways in which they can actually garner um, safety from other people. Like, okay, this is the purpose that I'm
mm,
serving. And if I keep serving this purpose, then you'll stay around me. And some of these lessons were learned in childhood and they
mhm,
kind of carry through as an adult, that you feel like you might not have worth if you don't take care of other people's needs before you. And over time, because you don't really let up that type of coping, you never also allow yourself the opportunity to assess whether or not that worldview is still holding true or not. I mean, it probably did hold true to some degree in your childhood with one of the primary caregivers or important adults in your life, but now you're
mhm,
an adult. Now you're grown up. And now
yeah,
you're finding a different situation, a different environment with different people. So, why do we keep applying the same worldview? Well, it's because, again, our brain favoring shortcuts is like creating these rules at an early time when we're rapidly learning and discovering about the world. So these things do tend to stick with us longer than lessons that we might learn later on in life. But because of
mhm,
these patterns, and because also people who have anxious attachment probably do really like helping people, it does make them feel good. It's kind of those
yeah,
behaviors, one of those behaviors that's kind of hard to kick, kind of like we were talking about with avoidant attachment. Like, being this quintessential lone wolf and being this high achiever, those are admirable qualities. So it's kind of hard to let go of the whole thing because they really do care
mhm,
about achievement. They really care about their careers too. It's not just a coping strategy, it serves multiple
mhm,
purposes. And so I think codependency just tends to be the most common for anxious attachment because they kind of have this need to rescue everybody in their life.
mhm. Yeah, I could see that. And I could see how sometimes breaking that pattern can be really difficult because it's so connected to their identity. And it's what's given them a sense of purpose for some people as well. Like I've been the person since I was young, take care of my younger siblings. I was the emotional support with my mom and I was dealing with abuse. And so it's like a formulation of their identity and it can show up in adulthood as well. And
Yeah.
so I just wonder about how to shift that without losing a part of who you are or feeling like you're losing a part of who you are.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good question. And it's all about, still staying authentic, but finding a balance. And so recognizing, for example, that, you do care about other people, you care about their well-being, but also just understanding that you're just as important as everyone else, number one. And number two, if you
Mhm,
truly do like to give and help people, you also need to fill your tank every once in a while, or else you're not going to have that capacity. And so really
mhm,
starting to see self-care as a necessity rather than just a luxury. Um, and then secondly, how do we find a way to validate your worth without having it be dependent on what others are reacting to, what situation you find yourself in, how much validation you're getting from everyone? Where's
mhm,
that internal place where you can validate yourself? And that all goes back to nurturing your inner child through your adult self and through reparenting strategies,
mhm.
which sounds like it could be something that feels like, oh, whoa, it's a little woo woo. Like, what do you mean by that? But, it is so
Yeah.
common for people to have that reaction. I totally understand it. But at the same time, um, nurturing your inner child is just like another conversation you have with yourself, which we have all the time, as we've established. Like, we're always having self talk. So you're just nurturing the part of yourself that has some unhealed wounds, but it's causing some problems
Mhm.
today in your life.
Yeah. How do folks know whether it's their inner child talking to them or some other thought or
Yeah.
like how can you identify like, oh, my inner child is needing nurturing.
Yeah.
That's what's showing up right now. How do they know?
Yeah, I think part of understanding what your inner child is going through is noticing the things that are triggering you. I
Hmm.
think once you notice that, and usually what does triggers do to people? Usually it means that you're going to overreact to something.
Hmm.
Like, of
For
course, you
sure.
you have the right to be annoyed at the situation, but why did you fly off the handle the way you did? Or
Hmm.
somebody does something that feels like, a total very very hurtful thing. And then you kind of generalize it to a lot of other things, like you're the same as so and so. It's like, okay, well, where did that come from? Like they're a different person, right? So you either have these overreactions or overgeneralizations, and that's when you know that
Mm-hmm.
there is something that was triggered. And usually the trigger relates back to a unmet uh, need from when you were a child, or like some wound or some pain or some trauma or major stress that you haven't allowed yourself to process. And the inner child is
Mm-hmm.
a little bit more, I'll say, volatile, but I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that they're just a little bit more
Mm-hmm.
impulsive, like all children are, right? They're not, their frontal
Yeah.
lobes aren't formed, right? When we're children. So
Yeah.
like kind of just like act on your feelings. And
Yeah.
so that's
Yeah.
why the overreaction. That's why the overgeneralization, because essentially that was like a reaction from your child self. It's like, like I feel upset and I can't even control, I can't even like manage that with my frontal lobe because it's such a deep wound that goes back to a time when my frontal lobe wasn't formed. Right. And that's how
Mm-hmm.
you identify what your inner child still needs today. And then it's really just about, once you find that way of identifying with them, and sometimes there's other things that you can do too to identify with your inner child. Like sometimes people like to do visualization exercises where they
Mm-hmm.
try to imagine their inner child at a time where they had a particularly stressful experience and what that was like, to try to bring out what was going on. Sometimes people write letters to their inner child or a letter from their inner child. Sometimes people look at
Mm-hmm.
photos of them as children to like try to recall stories. There's a lot of different ways to get in touch with that, but all of us have that metaphorical little us. And if you still don't believe me, then think
Mm-hmm.
about the last time that you regressed to a childhood activity when you got super stressed. Like we all do it sometimes. Maybe some people do it more than others, but like the part of you that wants to play video games and not work on your project, and the part of you that just wants to
Yeah.
binge watch some TV show instead of getting to sleep early because you're kind of stressed out about a big day tomorrow at work. I mean, we all do that from time to time. And that is your inner child crying out, like, I need attention. I need you to look at what's going on.
That's super helpful. And I think that gives people really specific examples about being able to identify, because I think sometimes it feels confusing,
Mhm.
or like, how do I know what that is? And there actually are ways that you can begin to notice. And when you're sharing, it made me think of like when adults throw tantrums, or like, or what looks like a
Yep.
tantrum, but it's like, well, that's actually your inner child screaming, like having an internal meltdown. Like, it's like being a toddler
Yeah.
again, right? Or it's like being a kid that didn't get something that they needed, and it can actually show up as an adult. And we've seen that happen. And also the self-inquiry is part of what I'm hearing, right? Like, we're responsible for our own healing, but of course we're not responsible for what happened to us.
Right.
And so sometimes there's that struggle, I notice, for folks that are healing through attachment or attachment wounding, which is the displacement or the placement of the anger, and sometimes that's gone inward, sometimes that's gone outward into their now partner, but it's really directed at their parents. And so this displacement, like, how do people deal with the displacement, and how do we affect that? Because we can see how that directly affects our intimate relationships, our friendships, our work relationships, like all of our relationships, right? But how do we address that displacement? Because I think it happens to everyone at some point.
Absolutely. And I think that as long as you kind of understand that, acknowledge where it's coming from, then you're also not going to be hiding certain parts of yourself, because sometimes we have those
Mm-hmm.
overreactions like, oh my gosh, that was so shameful. I can't believe I just screamed at my friend. Like it felt like it came out of
Mm-hmm.
nowhere. And then because you feel like you can't control it or you're embarrassed over the behavior, not only do you not get to the bottom of why that even happened, it also takes the power away of you being able to work on it and to actually do something positive about it. And then so there's just like that until it
Mm-hmm.
happens again, you know? And we want to
Yeah.
try to help people move through that so that they can say, okay, I know why that happened. There was a reason why that happened. Like, let's get curious about this. Let's try to figure out like why that happened and what was driving that, as opposed to, oh my gosh, so shameful, I want to just pretend it didn't happen and just move on.
Mm-hmm. I think about how important repair is, like how much more important it is than even the conflict itself. Because I think about when we're kids, a lot of kids, when there's an unmet need, or the inner child had an unmet need, it was also that they didn't receive the care or the comfort or the holding or whatever that repair is or was, that even as adults that gets mirrored, or that our experience gets re-triggered when that repair doesn't happen. And I think doing a lot of the couples work and client work, I think about that a lot, like looking at the conflict, reflecting upon ourselves, but also how important that repair aspect is and how healing that part of it is.
Yeah, yeah. And how, again, that you can repair like at any stage in your life. Like it's important to
Mm-hmm.
know that too. Like, well, I've been sitting with this idea for so long. Like, is it too late for me? And, no, it's not too late. There's always a time to be able to make improvements and repair.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask about this combination of a securely attached individual or person in partnership, whether that's friendship or work relationship or romantic relationship, with someone that has an insecure attachment, regardless of whichever one of those that may show up. And this experience that I often see, like the secure attachment person trying to hold it down, like hold the relationship, regulate the person. And there's this emotional labor that ends up, I think, the person that's securely attached ends up carrying, and they get really tired, right? They get like relationship fatigue. Say a little bit about how to navigate those kinds of relationships when that shows up, because I see like anxious and avoidant, we kind of have an idea about how that shows up. And let's just say, because this is the in between, this is like nuanced, there's healthy aspects, there's aspects that aren't as healthy. Can you say a little bit about that combination or those combinations?
Yeah, definitely. I think that so many of the times when somebody does maybe have a more secure attachment, they may feel like they have to shoulder the responsibility for their
Mm-hmm.
partner. Like, okay, well, and at first maybe they're even making excuses for them, like, okay, it's okay. They've gone through a lot in their life. There's a lot of trauma. Um, and
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe it's my responsibility to show them that they are loved and they are cared for, but obviously over time it can cause a lot of exhaustion. And it's also not your job as a more securely attached person relationship to do the self-development work for your partner. That's why it's called self-development. It's about them like
Yeah.
wanting to do that too. But I think that the most
Yeah.
important thing is to use active listening as a tool and just, express your
Mm-hmm.
concerns in a straightforward way. Let the person allow the person to react to it um, by summarizing or paraphrasing what they think they heard, so there's no miscommunications before moving on. And then just
Mm-hmm.
getting on the same page. Like, don't insinuate that there's intention behind certain behaviors that they do, but just say, this behavior that you do hurts me, or this behavior that you do frustrates me, and I'm trying to find a way forward. Can we kind of get on a team, get on the same page, and like, let's brainstorm
Mm-hmm.
together? Invite them into the dialogue and act as a team, because that's one of the things that I hear the most in couples work with my patients is like, I don't feel like we're on the same team anymore. And that's just big frustration that
Mm-hmm.
causes more and more separation. So if you can just kind of bring them back to that viewpoint of, I'm not blaming you, you're not the problem, but like, this is hurting me or this is bothering me. Like, can we get on the same page as a team and solve this problem together?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I see that a lot too, actually. Because when you're frustrated and there's this part of you that wants to be right
Mhm.
that shows up, and you forget sometimes that, like, oh, this is my partner, like we are on the same team. And I think that's why sometimes taking space away to not be in each other's space, even for a moment, like let's just take 10 and come back, right? So we can like reground and reorient ourselves in those moments, because ultimately I think it's the bid for connection, right? Like we feel disconnected and we're trying to figure out how to connect, and it can get turned into something challenging. And it makes me think about this segment you talk. I really love, actually, your book has all these exercises. I love active books because they really help us integrate and learn things in real time as concepts are coming in. And there's a segment you talk about types of intimacy, or like nourishing intimacy. They think about how to support clients or people in general on bringing them back to that sense of connection. And you talk about a couple forms of intimacy, which are physical intimacy, emotional intimacy, spiritual intimacy, intellectual intimacy, and experiential intimacy. And I don't know if most people think about intimacy as in like, wow, there's actually a lot of different forms of that. Um, what do you find it maybe is like one of the more challenging areas, and maybe people don't really think about when they think about intimacy? and how to maybe bring that to the forefront of their mind.
Yeah, some little known facts about intimacy. I mean, you went through just those categories, which I think a lot of people are not acquainted with. They don't, and they mostly think
Hmm.
about maybe emotional or sexual
Or
intimacy.
physical.
Yeah,
Hmm.
but they're not really thinking about these other forms. And like physical intimacy doesn't just have to be sexual. There's like other forms of physical intimacy as well. So I think that is definitely something that I think can help people just expand their minds um, about how much the different intimacies, the different categories of intimacy can do to help you with connection, not just with a romantic partner, but just with other people in your life. You may find that there's
Hmm.
certain friends where you have an excellent experiential intimacy with, where you do lots of activities where you guys share that and you guys can kind of enjoy those memories.
Hmm.
And maybe that
Hmm.
isn't necessarily something that you do as much with your partner. And that doesn't necessarily mean that your partner is wrong for you. I think that there's these ideas, and maybe it's from Hollywood movies where it's like, oh, you complete me. It's like one person can't shoulder all
Yeah.
of that, and that's not healthy. So I think it's okay to like absolve your partner of that responsibility and also check your own expectations about what a great relationship means on the romantic side, and just saying,
Mm.
well, sometimes one person just can't serve all my needs. So who else might I bond with? And we can talk about, for example, more creative pursuits, more intellectual pursuits.
Hmm.
Maybe if we don't see totally eye to eye with my partner there, like there's a different way to nourish that. I also think that
Hmm.
intimacy doesn't just come from happenstance. You have to nourish it consciously. And it is
Yeah.
important in your relationships to identify, well, where are we lacking? And if it is an important dimension for our relationship to thrive, like what are some little small things I can do every day to nourish this specific form of intimacy?
Yeah. It makes me also think about the intimacy and relationship in those categories to ourselves, right? And how do we nourish our own intellectual or emotional intimacy, and ways that we cultivate that so that we can show up, right, for others, and we can show up for ourselves in a way that's healthier, that's more self-expressed, and that they're both the relation. We often don't talk about the relationship to ourselves, which is bigger than self-care. Um,
Right.
yeah.
Exactly. And I think that self care, others care. I mean, it's also about like feeling integrated into a community, which is why nurturing all these
Hmm.
different aspects of intimacy is so important.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely hear that. I think we probably have room for one more kind of discussion topic or component before we go into Q&A. And I know we talked about attachment styles, particularly secure, avoidant, and a little bit on disorganized and mostly anxious. Um, a lot of times people talk about disorganized attachment being one of the most challenging areas. And I feel like there's some labeling of folks that are quote unquote disorganizedly attached, um, and a lot of shame.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, how can we help folks that maybe lean in these areas of a disorganized attachment have a little bit more grace and compassion for themselves, and maybe for other people, to elicit some compassion for who they are and maybe where they come from.
Yeah, definitely. I think the disorganized attached is the most misunderstood and secure attachment style of
Yeah.
all. Um, they first came to the fore from the original attachment studies research in the 60s and 70s because on the first research protocols, they couldn't really categorize them very well. It's like, well, this is the one that's like the catch-all. Like we know that this is not secure attachment. We know it's a form of insecure attachment, but it doesn't fit as well into like the anxious or the avoidant box. So we're just going to call these guys
Hmm.
disorganized. Also, the term is pretty stigmatizing in itself. Like you're
Yeah,
disorganized.
and confusing.
Yeah. But I think that over time it's become known for a couple of things, that it's not like, oh, if you're disorganized, that just means that you're, combination of anxious and avoidant. I mean, if you're a combination of anxious
Mhm.
avoidant, then that's what you are. Kind of like what we talked about earlier.
Anxious
Like
over
that's your shame. Yeah,
exactly.
that's the mix.
Yeah.
That's not disorganized. So that's not
Yeah.
quite right. And then the other piece is, okay, disorganized attachment is the one that has the most personality disorders. That's also not proven and also creates more
Hmm.
stigma. And then another one that I hear oftentimes about disorganized attachment is that you just can't heal from it. It's too hard to heal from it. You're just going to be, you
Mm.
know, the worst kind of attachment style for life. And while it might take a little bit more extra work and you might even benefit from maybe having a professional help you through some of these issues, people with disorganized attachment can heal also. Like so I think that that's what's so difficult. But I do think that the more quintessential identifying characteristic of disorganized that people have missed out on before. It's just that they have the most difficulty emotionally regulating because they spend most of their
Mm-hmm.
lives in fight or flight response. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's really about
Yeah.
calming their nervous system, helping them to achieve safety, and to understand that chaos isn't how their life always has to look, and that they have to learn to regulate their nervous system and to calm down during times of actual calm, that this is not like a signal for something that might horrible that might be happening next. That's what I hear a lot from my
Yeah.
disorganized attachment patients. It's like, well, when things are too calm, I feel like something terrible is going to happen. And that's just because they haven't gotten a lot of that when they were younger. And so they don't really know how to deal with that
Mm-hmm.
stillness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really difficult to tolerate peace.
Yeah.
And earlier I was talking about, I mentioned this bit around like the silence can feel so loud. And I can see that when internally and externally, chaos has been the norm. So when it's not that, then what is it? What do I do with that? And it's scary. It's actually more scary to be in that peace than to be in the chaos.
Right.
And
Exactly.
yeah, I totally hear and see that. And, and that I think it's wonderful to know, like, it doesn't have to be like that. You can heal from that. It's totally possible. And you don't have to live like this forever, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes we the self-labeling or the others creating the labels of them, end up pigeonholing them, and it doesn't have to be like that, which is great. Um, in your conclusion, you talk about the resilient self. And do you want to say a little bit more about what you mean by that, or how that's bringing us home and thinking about the resilient self or the
Yeah,
self?
definitely. I think that the most important thing to recognize about what secure attachment really means, and I say this actually in the essentially like the preamble of my book. It's like,
Mhm.
you know, having secure attachment isn't going to just all of a sudden bring you a million friends, solve all of your problems, and you're going to live a perfect life. Like that's nobody can do that. um,
Mhm.
it's really about understanding that when you have secure attachment, you have more resilience. You believe
Mhm.
in yourself. You believe in and you like yourself. You believe you can affect positive change. You believe you
Mhm.
can handle what comes your way, and you believe that you can be independent and rely on others at the same time. Those are the
Mhm.
four most common themes of self-talk that I see with securely attached people. So does that mean that you'll
Yeah.
never have problems? Of course not. Does that mean
Mhm.
that your all of your problems all of a sudden go away? No. Does that mean all your wounds, your own wounds, because secure attachment people also have wounds, does it mean that
Yeah.
those are all healed overnight? No. But does it mean that you believe that you have the capability to weather the storm when you have challenges? Yes, that's really the key. And I think that's why
Yeah.
working towards resilience is so important. Um, it's so interesting because I think so many people feel that resilience means that when there's a majorly stressful moment that they're just not stressed or something. It's like, no, they're stressed, but they just feel more confident that they have some kind of tool to manage the problem. Doesn't mean that they can solve it
Mhm.
and get rid of it, but that they believe in their ability to manage it. And people with secure
Yeah.
attachment just have more coping strategies at their disposal. They're more willing to try
Mhm.
different coping. And
Mhm.
they're also willing to essentially see the challenges in some ways, at least as a learning experience. Doesn't mean that you're always happy about them, but at least there's a part of you that
Mhm.
says, okay, well, what can I learn from this situation? Like, how can I use this to be better?
Yeah, like it's possible.
Yeah.
Like the possibilities are there, or a sense of hope. Earlier you talked about cognitive flexibility, and that secure attached folks have more cognitive flexibility. They're able to kind of move in those spaces a little bit better and emotionally regulate when things are arising. And so to hear about kind of building resilience, um, it sounds like there are some components such as um, increasing your ability to address emotional dysregulation. Is there other things that you think that would be helpful for those who are building resilience around things that they can address?
Well, I think values based work is always so important, which is
Mm-hmm.
like really asking yourself, what are the most important things in your life? What really matters to you? You know, how do you want to be
Mhm.
remembered when you're not on this earth anymore? How do you want people to talk about you when you're not in the room? What are those things that you can't check off, but should be the guiding compass of your life? And when you're able to get in touch with your values, I think that that also helps you to have psychological flexibility, because it's like, okay, well, I'm suffering right now. I'm stressed right now. I'm anxious right now, but I know that community is important to me. So even though it's hard, I'm still going to show up at this event to see my friends because I made a commitment and I want to be there. Right. It's essentially not making excuses to not do things that are important to you or to act in ways that would feel in concert to your values, even when you're going through moments of pain. It's like, no, but my life, it's important enough for me to keep moving forward in these value directions. I think that that's a huge part of cognitive
Yeah.
flexibility and psychological flexibility.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think it's maybe time for us to move into Q&A. I know there's lots of questions. I'm sure people really want to pick your brain and get your knowledge on some of these components that are just so relevant to people's experience. Should we dive into Q&A?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any last bits you want to share before we dive into Q&A?
No, I'm ready to get into
Yeah.
questions, but thank you so much
Okay.
for the awesome conversation so far.
Yeah, no problem. All right. One of the questions that came up from someone in the space and watching on YouTube is, how do you tell the difference between doing someone else's work for them versus being a supportive partner? Ooh, this is a good question.
So they said, what is the difference between, I'm looking at the Q&A.
Doing someone else's work for them
Uh-huh.
versus being a supportive partner.
Yep, I like this. Yeah. Doing someone else's work for them versus being a supportive partner. You know, I think this is kind of veers into some of our discussions about codependency, and how sometimes because of the goodness of our hearts, we're helping people, but we're actually just making things way too easy for them so they don't actually have to struggle or to develop or in any way actually grow. So I think this is how you know when you are doing the work for someone else, you're going to find yourself in the same pattern over and over again with like no forward movement.
Mm,
And it's just you kind of stepping in to resolve the situation for the two of you or for them or for you. If they're
mhm,
actually doing the work, you're going to have those struggles. But what you're going to see is that each time there's an incremental change. That each time maybe your partner is starting to connect the dots a little bit. They're starting to use kinder language when they talk to you during stress. They're not perfect, but they're starting to do more of those things on their own. And you can see that there's an incremental change happening versus just falling back into the same patterns over and over again. But then you're always bailing the
mhm.
two of you out of it.
Right, right. That's a really helpful, like, kind of clear barometer, right? Like
Yeah.
being able to be like, what's happening there?
Yeah. And also when you do the work for them, it might actually feel easier at first because it's you doing the work. So you're
Mhm.
like, I solved the problem, but it's like, but it just keeps coming back and it's going to be the same problem over and over again.
Yeah, you'll know.
Oh, yes, you'll know. Versus like if they're doing the work, it's more work. You're like, oh, just get there already. And, you know, sometimes that happens because maybe you're in a different place in your own self development and you're like, hey, like,
Mhm.
I know what you're supposed to do right now. But, you know, it actually takes more time. It takes more patience if they're actually doing the work themselves.
Yeah, it's like teaching them a new skill versus doing it for them,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
And so, yeah, totally. Somebody's so someone had a question really around like the if all the different styles of attachments are equally challenging. This particular person listening in is anxiously attached and they feel like it's really difficult for them and one of the most difficult attachment styles. So the question really is about like, are they all equally as hard or some easier to manage or get through than others?
I think that is probably obviously whatever you're going through probably feels the hardest because it's your
It's the
experience.
hardest.
So I totally
Agree.
understand this person's question. And I think that it makes so much sense that it would feel like you're having the most difficulty because, again, you have that different view when you're looking at somebody else from the outside. You don't know their internal struggle. You only know your internal struggle. But I
Mhm.
would say that every single style has its challenges, also has its like positive points. And as long as you're willing to work
Mhm.
on it, it's always possible to do it.
Got it. Okay. Um, there's this one question. It's like a multiple part question. So I'm gonna actually see if I can have it put in the chat and ask it at the same time so we can get a handle on it. So this question from the audience said, I feel that with attachment theory, if you don't have a secure attachment, then there's this feeling that something's wrong with me or my partner, like the stigma, something's wrong with me. How do I accept the type of attachment my partner and I currently have and recognize that it doesn't mean there's something wrong with us or that it has to change or can change?
Yeah. So I guess this is part of what we were talking about regarding the labeling. A lot of times people will feel like, okay, I got this insecure attachment diagnosis. It's not even a diagnosis, but they'll like say that, right? It's like, this is what's going on with me. And then they self-identify with it and they're like, there's something wrong with me. And they use that to reinforce their negative ideas. I would say that attachment is fluid and it's not necessarily a category. We've been trying to dispel that myth a little bit through our conversation, Dr. Kini. And it's this idea of you could be showing shades of an insecure attachment. It could be a couple of different styles, different environments bring up different styles, or you can even be secure sometimes. So really kind of like loosening yourself from that particular label, right? You don't have to literally like walk around with it taped on your forehead. It's not something that necessarily even follows you forever. And you can acknowledge, okay, this is kind of how I'm showing up right now, but I'm also working on it. And really seeing that, like really valuing process and progress over identification. I think that that's important. It's like, oh, I'm a work in progress, just like everybody else. And I'm in the process of healing my insecure attachment. And it doesn't mean that I have to completely be defined by this all the time.
Yeah, that's great. I think it also gives us some space and leeway because when we do that labeling, it can put a lot of pressure on us.
Yeah.
And the kind of expectations we put on ourselves and our partners when it's already hard enough to be in a relationship and be healthy and engage and connect when we don't actually need added pressure or expectation.
Right, exactly.
Somebody asked from the audience, if you are securely attached and you come to realize that your partner is not, and that is the cause of some of your difficulties, is there a good way to talk to them about it and suggest working towards change? What if they get defensive or non-responsive? Another great question. I'm going to put it in chat if that's helpful.
Yeah, that's great.
Too.
I think this kind of speaks to one of your questions for me earlier, which is, how do we manage it when one person might be a little bit more ahead in their self-development? Maybe the person is securely attached in a relationship and there's an insecurely attached person. And we kind of talked about one strategy, which is just to use active listening and to call out the behavior and how it's making you feel without stating an intention. And then getting on the same team, like how can we work together, to try to solve this problem?
Can you give an example of what that would look like stating that without setting the intention? Like how would that sound?
Yeah, like when you leave, like completely leave the house during our arguments, that really hurts me. But then you might be tempted to be like, I know it's because your dad abandoned you in your childhood. Like, don't, or like, I know you like to do this because it makes you maintain control over our relationship. Like, that's where we start to state intention, right? But if you just say, it really hurts me when you leave the house when we have an argument, right? Like, without interpreting what it means, but then just saying, how can we like problem solve this so that we can find some balance? Like, I'm happy to give you space, but can you just stay in the house and then we can just determine how many hours of space you need before we can come back together and talk about it again, right? Like, if you don't like that idea, you throw out some ideas, like, let's get on the same page. That would be like an example of how you might want to try to have that conversation.
Yeah, I hear that. And the kind of like the partnership aspect, you're the kind of bringing back to the we component and that we're partners in this. And it isn't about whose fault it is, who's to blame, who's better than, who's more secure, who's less secure, but that we're on the same team and we're in it together.
Right.
That's what I'm hearing in that response.
Exactly.
So a question from one of the audience members is about the feminist body theory. So how does feminist body theory inform your assertions on attachment theory? If a body is inherently political and systemically conditioned to be insecure, for example, women or racialized women, how does that person conquer the truth their body keeps nagging them with? And I, again, will put that in the chat. There's lots of parts to this question.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's a very thoughtful question.
mhm,
I've had another question earlier today as I was talking to somebody about attachment, where they were saying, are there certain like cultural norms or cultural upbringings that sort of lead women to have insecure attachment, particularly the anxious style, that seemingly being more
mhm,
common among women because women are already, expected to put others people's needs before them at times from their own like childhood upbringing, or like expected to be more caretaking and nurturing. So then that leads to more codependency. And I would say that with this specific
mhm,
question, feminist body theory provides a really important framework for understanding certain pieces of attachment theory. And I think that there's a couple of different things about attachment styles that feminist body theory would inform. One of them would be intersectionality. So, feminist body theory emphasizes the intersectional nature of identity and
mhm,
acknowledges that a person's experience of attachment is shaped by multiple intersecting factors that might include gender, race, class, sexuality, ability, and so forth. So that's one way that can be informed. The second one is power dynamics. So feminist body theory recognizes that bodies are sites of power struggles and social control, especially for marginalized groups. And in the context of
mhm,
attachment theory, this perspective would eliminate how power dynamics within society can influence individuals' attachment styles and how they relate to other people as well as their self-concept. So one example would be perhaps women and minority individuals experiencing heightened insecurity and vulnerability due to some of these systemic inequalities. Um,
mhm,
Also, trauma and healing. This is another area where feminist body theory acknowledges the impact of trauma on people's relationships. And so, women and
mhm,
racialized individuals might carry some form of intergenerational trauma that stems from systemic oppression and historical injustices. And so, understanding that is
mhm,
also really important. And so, I think in terms of how to heal from that, really having that critical awareness of societal messages and recognizing and continuing to challenge ones that harm you in this way, practicing some
mhm,
self compassion and self care, especially because you can't expect to unpack all of this in one day or in one therapy session. It might be a gradual
mhm.
process. And then really leaning into
Yeah.
community support. So, seeking support from people that you find are like minded, that might understand how you're
Mhm,
feeling. And this may even extend to therapeutic work that perhaps that goes into your selection of therapists, somebody who is
mm,
familiar with this theory or like you feel like would understand at least on
yes.
some level, not just with their professional experience, but maybe with their personal experience, that they can understand a little bit of what
Mhm,
you're talking about. So I think those are
yeah.
just some of the suggestions off the top of my head.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm like snaps all around as I'm hearing you answer this question. We have a couple more questions coming through. I read that for an anxious attached person, it is best to find someone with a secure attachment. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think maybe for most people who have insecure attachment, they're probably thinking, well, the ideal partner, of course, would be a securely attached person, no matter what insecure attachment style you have. And while that might be true, I do think that two people with insecure attachment styles can have a
Mhm.
wonderful relationship.
Yeah.
And I think that the main components to have great relationships with other styles that might be also having insecure attachments at this moment in time when you're getting together, is like openness to talk about, things that affect you and wanting
Mhm,
to learn more about yourself, like just having that
mhm,
acknowledgement that you're a work in progress, like that's really important. And then secondly, the willingness to try new things to improve yourself so that the relationship can improve. That I think is really
mhm,
important. And then I think the third thing is just having compassion for your partner, knowing that
mhm,
sometimes they're going to act out in certain ways. That's like their inner child screaming. But, can you see past that to say, you know, I see that this is a reaction of your inner child. And as long as it's not one of like your big no nos, like red flag, like I'm not accepting this kind of behavior, like, is it okay that like they yelled at you today? You wish they didn't, but like, it wasn't inherently abusive in any way. They yelled at you, they yelled at the top of their lungs, they didn't call you names, they didn't put you down, but they just like screamed off the top of their
in
head.
their frustration or
Right. And you're
something.
like, okay, that's your
Uh-huh.
inner child. Like, are you willing to like accept that, understand it, and help you and your partner move through it? Like I said, as long as it does not
Mm-hmm.
trespass any of your boundaries that you're like, this is a no-no. Can you have
Yeah.
compassion for your partner that they're crying out for help? And it's not your
Mm-hmm.
responsibility to, you know, get them to heal, but as a loving partner, what can you do to support that work and just recognize what they're going through?
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. I think sometimes it's hard for folks to be able to discern between what's abusive or what is something like this, like an acting out. And where is that line? Like, where is that as we're, because it can be a bit of a slippery slope sometimes, right? And so
Yeah.
I think knowing yourself and knowing where that boundary is for yourself and having clarity with that boundary is going to help you discern. But yeah, thank you for that.
Definitely.
This question actually is kind of related.
Mhm.
This particular audience member was asking, what are ways in which we can help someone slowly recover from disorganized attachment? And some of it may be related to what you're just sharing about within themselves and their partnerships, but in general, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think again, you know, really being able to discern, am I doing the work for this person or allowing them to make these
Mm-hmm.
discoveries? And
Mm-hmm.
I think the other piece is, you know, once they are recognizing, hey, I have an insecure attachment style, and particularly a disorganized one, instead of judging them and telling them what they need, I think it's much a better approach to say, well, how can I help? Or like, how can I support your work? Like, what can I do that can make this process easier? You know, because
Mm-hmm.
you may think certain things will help them, but it's better to hear it from them because everybody is different in terms of what they need. And you can't really read their minds, and you should empower them to like brainstorm that themselves and come up with the ways in which are going to be
Mm-hmm.
the most helpful and soothing for them. So I think just regular
Yeah.
checking in and like, hey, like anything I can do to support, anything I can do to help, like let me know. We could discuss it. Yeah.
I love that you mentioned this mind reading thing because it shows up actually quite a bit. Like I see it in anxious attached folks sometimes and other kinds of insecure attachments where they have now run through their head the whole scenario about what might be going on. And so when we're stepping into that place, their partner may be like, well, what are you talking about? Like, what is happening right now? Because of that piece, right? Where our minds can really take over our thought process. And then we have now then imposed our viewpoint, our assumption, our judgment, or a viewpoint onto that person. So
Right.
it's made me think a little bit about that too.
Exactly.
Can you say a little bit more, speak to, they use the word earned secure, or I think they mean learned secure, especially for people who are avoidant in intimate relationships. Can you speak more about, learning to be secure, especially for people who are avoidant in intimate relationships?
Yeah. So this idea of learned or earned secure refers to this more transitional attachment style, essentially meaning
Mm-hmm.
that you're moving from avoidant attachment to a more secure attachment.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that the idea, you know, for me, I don't distinguish between learned or earned secure and just secure. Like once you're secure, you're
Mm-hmm.
like secure. To me, it's you know,
Yeah.
you don't need to say that because I think sometimes it takes away from, oh, like I'm not really a secure person. Like I have to earn it. It's like, no, you are secure, period, the end.
Yeah.
Like I really want to have that message go forward. But I understand the distinction. People are basically saying this is a way to understand people who maybe did not have secure attachment earlier, but then as an adult, they
Mm.
developed it through their own work. And I would say that, you know, for people who have avoidant tendencies, especially in intimate relationships, becoming more
Mm-hmm.
securely attached involves introspection, it involves relational skills building, it involves healing your own attachment wounds and building trust and vulnerability with people in your life. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes people with avoidant attachment, they don't like to look at their inner life. They don't want to recognize and acknowledge their relational patterns and emotional needs. They like to
Mm-hmm.
think of themselves as, you know, recluses, lone wolves, like all these kinds of names.
Yeah.
But the truth is, every single human being needs connection. It's just the way that we're biologically and evolutionarily built. It doesn't mean that you have to have 100
Mm-hmm.
friends, but it does mean you need to have at least one friend. So a quality friend, you know? And so just even
Mm-hmm.
recognizing that is part of that work. And then healing attachment wounds, avoidantly attached people, they had attachment wounds where people didn't show up for them, where people dismissed their negative emotional expressions, told them that that didn't
Yeah.
matter, or that they should be doing something else with their time. And so
Mm-hmm.
really being able to address those wounds, and then to look for supportive
Yeah.
relationships where people don't shut you down, and increasing your own emotional vocabulary, that's going to be a big piece of it. And then also building trust and vulnerability. People with avoidant attachment don't trust other people inherently. It's kind of like, yeah, I can trust you
Mm-hmm.
when things are good, but when things are not good, I don't think I can trust you. But then because of their
Mm-hmm.
style and their coping, they're not going to actually put any information out there for people to respond to disprove that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really
Right.
about, like, in small pieces, letting little things go and saying, well, what if I just put this bit out there? Like, let's see if they're going to answer in a supportive way. Being able to challenge that through behavioral experiments to build trust and vulnerability. And then
Yeah.
reframing beliefs about intimacy. A lot of people with avoidantly attached styles, they hold negative beliefs about intimacy and dependency. They kind of look at people with that kind of
Mm-hmm.
core need as people who are weak, people who are vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of look at them with disdain.
Right.
And so earning this secure attachment involves challenging these beliefs and adopting a more pro-social
Mm-hmm.
perspective on relationships, and understanding that
Right.
interdependence is absolutely the best way to be for almost all human beings. And that, like,
Mm-hmm.
just because you have uh, needs for intimacy and dependency, um, doesn't make you weak. You have to kind of teach yourself
Yeah.
to understand that, and to learn to co-regulate. People who have avoidant attachment, they tend
Mm-hmm.
to, like, try to regulate themselves all by themselves. But
Mm-hmm.
co-regulation is so important. We have a lot of important human and animal studies that suggest that when you're around calming, supportive individuals, like, everybody's
Yeah.
cortisol goes down, right? Like, we should be able to
Mm-hmm.
lean into that more. That's why group meditations, group yoga classes, group hiking, like, all of those things are so relaxing, because there is
Yeah.
something about being around other human beings that you have some trust with, that allows you to let go of that fight or flight response and your stress response, and be
Mm-hmm.
able to really kind of be in a place of growth and healing. And so really being able to even tap into that, I think that those are some of the tips for the avoidantly attached.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I can see how that just probably speaks to a lot of folks who might be struggling with that or have a partner that may have this disposition. I love that you mentioned co-regulation, because oftentimes we think about self-regulation, emotional regulation. We don't often talk about this in this relational way. And yet it can be like our pets can co-regulate with us, or
Mhm.
other friends, or even connecting with the earth, right? But co-regulating with other folks and other people, but there's actually a lot of ways that we can do that
Yeah,
to support our well-being.
definitely.
This question is referencing a book that I think we both know, The Body Keeps the Score. What are your thoughts about how that score, associated with trauma, violence, rape, etc., determines one's attachment style?
Yeah, so love the book. Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Pretty seminal piece
Mm-hmm.
of work regarding trauma
Mm-hmm.
experience and healing. Um, and I think that the most important takeaways on how it informs attachment style is that we do know that most people who have been through severe trauma, they are more likely to trend toward a disorganized attachment style. And
Mm-hmm.
as I mentioned earlier, I think the core defining characteristic for the disorganized attachment style is a harder time emotionally regulating and being in fight or flight all the time. And those coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, are also some of the defining features of post-trauma responses, such as PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
So that
Mm-hmm.
hyperarousal and hypervigilance, that's one of the definitions or symptoms of PTSD. Avoidance and emotional numbing, that's another common symptom. Having intrusive memories and flashbacks, that can interfere with the ability to engage in secure attachment behaviors. Whenever you start to get around
Mm-hmm.
somebody and try to develop a healthy connection, these flashbacks will just, like, cause you to push the person away, or, like, not be able to engage in
Mm-hmm.
intimacy, for example. And then
Mm-hmm.
even a reenactment of trauma. People who have
Mm-hmm.
experienced trauma might unconsciously reenact some of these experiences, perpetuating patterns of abuse, victimization, and avoidance, which then, of course, creates even more trauma and more disconnection, and leaning in more to some of the traits of the disorganized attached. And so the good thing that, as we've been talking about, is that healing and recovery are possible with appropriate support and interventions. In my book, I actually highlight some, slightly simpler trauma-informed techniques that you can actually do at home. Of course, do more work with your professional treaters as well. But I did include some trauma-focused CBT techniques, some EMDR and somatic experiencing techniques, grounding techniques. All of these things can help with a insecure attachment that was formed from trauma.
Great, thank you. And one more question. It's a question around, what does current research say that the average USA population norms are like for secure versus insecurely attached? It sounds like a bit of a census, or what does it indicate?
This is actually a great question because I did a bunch of research on this right before preparing for my recent TEDx talk in Reno, and actually found this really interesting study by YouGov. It was a recent study in the last couple of years, and it said through a population survey of people living in America that 70% of people would identify themselves as insecurely attached. I think that number is probably an underrepresentation because that's the people who are really being honest and self-reflective, especially
Right.
people who are avoidant. I could see them being insecure, and then the people in their life
Yeah.
saying, "Are you sure? Because you kind of run away from this intimacy sometimes, So I think that's 70% is probably a understatement. And as you know, Dr. Kini, like with social research and psychological research, when it's self-report, people tend to report a rosier picture. So like that would have happened anyway, no matter what their attachment styles were. It's like, oh, my attachment's great, So I think it's at least 70%. I think it's probably closer to 80.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. That looks like all the questions that we have. I feel like our audience had some really great questions and contributions to our talk as well. I think it's really funny. I actually thought the number was going to be lower. And so seeing that result, I'm like, that's interesting. And something to know about. There's something that I listened to recently on, I forgot who was mentioning, I think the Angry Therapist. Do you know his work? He was talking about how a lot of us are going to actually meet somebody who is likely dealing with some level of insecure attachment, and that we will probably trigger each other, and relationships will likely be challenging. And so knowing that, kind of stepping into that space with one another, we then have a sense of knowing that this will be part of what we're working through together. And so there's some expectation that it's okay. It's okay to step into these spaces and know that we'll probably trigger each other. We probably have some, attachment stuff, and we can get through it together.
Yeah, I love that. It's such a great kind of parting sentiment to have about like getting through something together, which is really, that's what it's all about for sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It was so good to hang out with you and chat and really talk about these topics of attachment that are so essential, I think, to the human experience. So thanks for coming here and being our guest today.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation too. Appreciate you.